Good morning, everybody. My name is Todd Ziebarth, and I'm with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And I'm moderating today's session entitled Just When You Thought You Did It All. And the focus of today's session is going to be on how states are refining their charter school laws to meet some of the biggest opportunities and challenges that the charter school movement faces 20 years after Minnesota enacted the nation's first charter school law. We have three panelists who are going to be walking us through how states are addressing some of these issues. To my immediate left is Senator Rich Crandall, who's the chair of the Senate Education Committee in the Arizona legislature. The senator is not only a true champion for public charter schools in the state, but a true champion for all forms of school choice. To his left is Jed Wallace, who's the president and CEO of the California Charter Schools Association, which represents charter schools in the state of California. Jed also formerly was the COO of High Tech High, which is a high-performing charter management organization in California, and before that was an authorizer working for the San Diego Unified School District, and before that was a public school teacher. So Jed brings a variety of hats to the discussion, and he's also on the board of my organization, the National Alliance. And then to his left is Fernando Zulueta. Fernando is the president of Academica Corporation, which is one of the nation's oldest and most successful charter school support organizations, operating schools now in several states across the country. And Fernando also is a member of the National Alliance board. So I wanted to just at the beginning here very quickly make a couple of points about where we're at in the charter school movement nationally right now. We currently have about 5,300 charters open serving about 1.8 million kids. There's probably about 400 to 500 charters opening up every year and about 150 to 200,000 new kids enrolling in charter schools each fall. We have about 400,000 parents on waiting lists to get into charter schools, so not only is there steady growth in enrollment, but there's pent-up demand on waiting lists from parents for more public school options. In New Orleans right now, 70% of the public school students in that city are enrolled in public charter schools. And in fact, in 6 communities across the country, at least a third of the kids are in charters, and in 18 communities, at least a fifth of the kids are in charters. So we're seeing an enormous impact year after year at the local level in charters. And I think these numbers are going to continue to grow because there's been a lot of progress over the last couple of years in state legislatures around lifting caps, expanding authorizing, improving accountability, and starting to make a dent in some of the fiscal equity and facilities issues that the movement faces. But as we all know who work on this, growth is only one part of the story. And another part, if not a more important part, is the quality of the schools that are being created. There's good news here in that there's an increasing number, there are increasing numbers of high-performing schools and networks of schools operating across the country, but there's also a notable minority of chronically low-performing charter schools. And so as part of the discussion today, we're going to talk about how to deal with that. And then lastly, I think it's somewhat remarkable the movement has been able to accomplish what it has in light of the substantial political opposition that we face in just about every state. I think Arizona and Florida to some degree may be unique in that you have more support in the legislature, more broad support in the legislature for charters, but in most states where we work in, and California is probably one of them, it's enormously controversial and enormous resistance to charters from some very well-funded opponents. So I want to start off the discussion with the panelists with Senator Crandall and really getting at the fact that the first charter law was passed in 1991 before the internet really took off, and it really wanted to build on the theme of this conference. There are a growing number of charter schools that are making use of online learning in some way or another, either by being a full-time virtual charter school or being a blended school with some in-person and some online. And based upon your work in Arizona, what do you think states can do to bring the best of brick and mortar together with the best of technology to radically improve student achievement?
That's a loaded question to start off the session. But thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. In Arizona, it's just a given. I mean, charter schools are right there with districts. It's been around for 20 years, and so it's just there. Let me give you a great example. I have 7 kids from a junior in college down to some 3rd grade twins, and so I prepared a slide that I share often on my 3rd graders. As they were getting ready to go into 3rd grade, it's a boy and a girl. I said, okay, how many options do they have for 3rd grade within 15 miles of where we live? Literally just 15 miles. I loved that video yesterday of the milk. That was so well done, and I hope that's available somewhere to show. So we go through, and within 15 miles, there's 57 district elementary schools. There's 32 charters, there's parochials, there's privates, I count homeschool, but my wife will slit her throat before we homeschool. I am hugely supportive of it. It's just not going to happen in our home. Many of you, I'm sure, can relate to that. At the same time, we also have numerous virtual schools, as you just mentioned. My 2 3rd graders have 113 options for 3rd grade. We go way beyond soy, milk, and organic in Arizona. Now, our challenge is that's almost too much choice. Hannah Scandera made a great point this morning when she said, choice is good, but only if it's quality choice. You're going to hear from Jed talk about California. Our #1 threat to our charter school movement is that really, for most parts, they mirror our districts in performance. That bell curve is the same state to state, and you're going to hear a little bit about California. There's a little bit different curve. To offer just the same alternatives as districts is not going to get us anywhere. So now let's get to your specific question about blended learning. We know that if you go all the way back to Benjamin Bloom, 1984, he's at the University of Chicago, does his study that says, what would happen if we had one-to-one learning? Obviously before the internet, like you had mentioned also. So what's going to happen? He does his study. For those who haven't seen it, he ends up with 2 standard deviations of gain, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of race. It doesn't matter. He gets 2 standard deviations of gain in this study that he does at the University of Chicago. And it's pretty much for one reason that he gets that gain, and that reason is, I'm not teaching something you've already mastered. So time on task is truly time on task. And that was really the big difference. So now we fast forward, and it's like, well, thank you, Dr. Bloom, for telling us that. It's theoretically impossible to do one-to-one, so that was one of those great studies that meant nothing. All of a sudden, fast forward, though, 25 years, 2011, we now have technology that can bring us similar, as close to possible of one-to-one, excuse me, differentiated instruction, personalized instruction. So now we say to our districts and our charters, let's get the laws out of the way. And we have our House Education Chair in the very back, Representative Doris Goodale. I'm the Senate Education Chair. So working together, we've tried to eliminate most of the barriers in place. Now, Jeb Bush's group, there's always more they expect from you. It's like, come on. 72 points. So last night, I take the 72 points, go back to my hotel room, and I start putting an okay next to the ones we've done, and I circle the ones. And both Doris and I thought, there's probably 6 to 10 that we still need to do in Arizona. After we got up to 42 of the 72 still to do, it's like, oh, let's leave now. We have some work to do. But okay, so we're going to get out of the way. 95% of what needs to happen in digital and blended learning is not dependent on us as lawmakers. We've gotten out of the way on most of it. Some of the seat time we need to work on. We need people to step up, and I'm pleased to say right here, Dr. Roberchet runs one of our top charter schools in Arizona. And I'll give you some statistics in a minute on Arizona, but she is trying to figure out, how do I take a blended learning school to inner city Phoenix and offer a choice that is that personalized instruction? She doesn't need help necessarily from Doris and I. Now, she may come to us and say, I need this policy changed. And you know what? We'll do it like that, and we will probably get 60-0 in the House and 30-0 in the Senate. That's how our legislature works for that. Now, not on everything, but on this issue of school choice, we often get unanimous decisions.
As you talked about the barriers and the work that you've done in the past in removing the barriers, for some of those states who are kind of at the initial stage, what would you say are the 3 biggest barriers that you had to remove in order to allow online learning to flourish?
Would you come back to me on that
Sure.
one? Because that's such a key question, I don't want to just shoot from the hip on that. That's a critical question you've asked, and I want to think about that.
Sure. Fernando, I know this year Florida passed Florida has a history with their statewide virtual school in offering online learning, but I know some legislation was passed this year to actually expand it beyond just that one school and to allow, for example, virtual charter schools and some other things. Can you say a little bit about what Florida did on this issue this session?
Well, yeah, Florida actually passed two important pieces of legislation this year, one of which was the Digital Learning Act. And in doing so, Florida eliminated a long-standing impediment to having charters participate in blended and online learning. That had really been probably one of the few pitfalls in Florida's charter school law. Otherwise, it's an incredibly supportive law. But Florida had limited online learning to pretty much the Florida Virtual School this year. Now, for the first time, charters can offer both blended learning, which is the blended models we've all heard about, as well as pure virtual charter schools. So we're getting incredible pushback right now from school districts. I know that we've filed a number of applications for both virtual schools, and the blended ones we've already initiated because you can do that with your existing charters. So we have currently more than 6,000 students already participating in blended learning. To give you an idea, the network we work with in Florida at Academica, in Florida we have about 30-some thousand students in our network of schools in the state. So we have about 70 schools, 70 charter schools we work with in Florida, about another 30 charter schools outside of Florida. But in Florida, we were able to pretty much get a fifth of those students on with blended learning environments this year. And that's just our first year being able to do that. We were ramping up. We weren't sure the law was going to pass. We were glad it did, and we had been ramping up to be able to offer that for the last couple of years. So it's making a huge difference. We're seeing significant improvements in student learning outcomes already as a result.
Right. Jed, I know California was one of the early states to pass the charter law, and there's been some history there as well with virtual charters, some good and some not so good. What would you kind of advise as you think about, on the one hand, charters is the optimal place to really experiment and innovate with all kinds of different things, including online learning, which California has done. what are a couple of the key takeaways from California's experience with digital learning or online learning over the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, I would say that the charter school context is the healthiest context to drive whatever reform of public education you're most passionate about. And if you are passionate about online learning, charter school space is the place to do it. And I think the key thing to have in place for online learning, as well as for all charter schools, is a policy environment that supports quality. And it's interesting that just this last session, we had a bill that made it almost to the end. We're on the 2-yard line. This bill would have it combined, I think, exactly what we want, which is higher minimum performance expectations for charters, a tighter process so that those schools that are actually missing those minimum standards are closed, and a breakthrough so that hybrid schools would be able to access new funding streams that they've previously been not able to access. And the group that came together to stop that were our traditional detractors, and then those within the charter community who are opposed to high standards, or to standards that, I don't want to unfairly characterize it, they have good points to make about our academic system not being perfect, and want that system to be improved before high-stakes decisions are made. And we believe that the need is high enough that we have to go forward with the system that we have. So our hope is that on both of those fronts, that in terms of putting in place the quality standards that we need and the means to be able to enforce them, along with the freedom and funding that should come to all public education students, will be a recipe that's ultimately most beneficial to all charter schools and certainly to online schools as well.
Good. I want to come back to this issue of closures that you hinted on there a little later, but I saw the senator was writing down 3 points, and so want to get to those before we move on to the next topic.
You bet. Want to have a chance to think about it real quick. Number one is 4 years ago we took the restrictions off. For some reason, back in the early 90s, we said, okay, we will allow 7 online charter schools and 7 districts. Now, just to give you a number, we have 524 charter schools. we have 227 districts. And for some reason, we said, ooh, we're terrified of this digital learning. We're only going to allow 7 and 7. And for 13 years, we only allowed 7 and 7. So 4 years ago, we said, that's ridiculous. And it's interesting because we had run the bill several times and the governor, Napolitano, kept vetoing it. People just terrified. And it was always Chicken Little. All of their fears didn't materialize. Took the restrictions off, and now we have about 40 to 45 virtual charters that are moving right now, several full-time virtuals. Still, it's a very small part of the population. When you talk about full-time, and is Mickey here from Connections? I don't know if Mickey's in. Anyway, you talk to Mickey from Connections and the K-12 folks, I think about 3% is what they consider saturation of a state. 14% of Arizona students are in charters. So as one of the state superintendents said this morning, the majority of your kids are going to be in districts, but this competition needs to be driven by the charters. And so for those who were at one of the sessions yesterday, a guy named Rick Ostick founded Carpe Diem in Yuma. He's done a fantastic job for a niche with blended learning. So number one, we took the restrictions off. We have no restrictions for geography, for numbers. You can, as long as you meet the application standards. Reciprocity, allowing those credits to move between districts and charters and virtuals. Everything moves and counts toward your graduation. And then also our funding model for charters, you basically get 2 lump sums of cash, and you have tremendous flexibility what to do with that. Now we fund charters different than districts, and I'll be very upfront. When the charter movement came into being 20 years ago, the big pitch that was made by those pushing for charters is, if you keep the red tape out, we think we can educate kids better for less money. There is a small faction within the charter school world now who's saying, well, that's not exactly what we meant. And so they're suing us. They've been suing us for 2 years. And we ask them, okay, what do you want? And they will not tell us what this is. They won't even tell the judge what exactly they want, because if they peg it to a number, they're terrified that they'll actually get it, and then what happens over time. So those were the 3 big things. Oh, the last, I threw in a 4th, authorizers. Each year we've kind of expanded who could be an authorizer, and the big one we did, so I mentioned 524 charter schools. 517 of those are through our state board for charter schools. But we also we allow universities now, and so they charter a school, and then districts can authorize a charter. And we're starting to see districts see the benefits and the flexibility, and so they'll take less money if they can be a charter.
Great. I want to move now to the second both opportunity and challenge that the charter movement faces, and it's around replication and expansion of high-performing charter schools. When the first laws were passed in the early to mid-'90s, I think most folks were really envisioning a sector full of independent mom-and-pop charter schools. And fairly early into the movement, we saw for-profit management organizations emerge like Edison Schools. Later on, we saw the nonprofit charter management organizations emerge, Aspire Public Schools being one of the first ones in California. Most people in the room are probably familiar with KIPP, lots of others now. If you look at the data on the proportions of these different parts of the sector, what you see is that the percentage of the sector that's comprised of the nonprofit management organizations is growing from about 12% in 2007 to 16% in 2009. The for-profits also, that part of the sector has grown from about 10% in 2007 to about 13% in 2009. And then the mom and pops, or the independents, has reduced from about 78% to 71%. So the sector is changing in terms of the proportions of these different management organizations versus the mom and pop and independents. And so I think one of the questions that I want to start with Fernando, he kind of hinted at a couple of laws Florida passed this year. One was around virtual, another one was around replication and expansion. And Fernando, from your perspective, what can states do to encourage replication and expansion of high performers while also keeping the playing field level, though, for the mom and pops who want to start? Because if you look at some of our highest performing networks across the country, they started out by a group of people getting together saying, hey, we want to go do a school. They do a school, it's great. Why don't we go do another one, and so on and so on. And so how can we encourage the best to do more while also leaving the door open for the next great Aspire, KIPP, or whomever? Well,
I think the way Florida did it this year, and we've been working with the state for a couple of years to try to get that legislation, and I think it's the first such law in the nation, and that is Florida passed a law that favors, that provides benefits to high-performing charter schools. Now, the law has two prongs to it, which is important. It recognizes both high-performing charter schools, the individual schools, like you mentioned, that are high-performing, as well as high-performing charter school networks. And I think that's the key element in it. You do not, it benefits both types of organizations. And that way the single, the mom and pop can and what it does for the single charter school, the individual high-performing charter school, is that it allows that school, number one, to replicate. So it gives them what they call it, a fast pass, let's say an easy way to obtain a new charter and replicate its existing one. And it also clears up some of the red tape that's associated with the reporting process in the charters in the state. We had, for example, a monthly financial statement reporting requirement, which was somewhat onerous and certainly unnecessary for a school that has a 3-year unblemished financial record and a 3-year high-performing academic record. And those are the underlying requirements for being a high-performing charter. For a high-performing network, those are defined as groups of schools that are operating, for example, under the same board and that have at least 3 high-performing charter schools in their network, and where more than half of the schools in the network, so let's say you have 5 in your network, at least 3 of those need to be high-performing, and none can be low-performing, by the way, so there can't be any school that under the requirements established in the law, which are tied directly to the state academic and financial accountability requirements, none of them can be low-performing. So it puts a great deal of let's say, an onus on you to make sure the network is entirely performing well, and that clearly at least half of the network is has a high-performing designation. I think one of the things I've been seeing in the last 15 years that I've been involved with charters, and I've been seeing it, and I couldn't find data on it as far as studies, but I've been seeing it in real life, is I've been seeing the power of affiliation. And then one of the things I noticed is, as I worked with groups of schools and they replicated and became larger groups, and currently we work with a couple of groups, for example, the Somerset Academies have about 30 charters. They're operating in 3 states, and they're over 13,000 students just in that network alone, and very high performing. The Matter Academy network, similar. They have 20-some charter schools, 9,000 students, and that one is mostly in South Florida. But I did notice, and since we work with networks of schools as well as individual schools, when I looked at the data, the larger networks were outperforming the smaller networks, and in turn, the individual schools when aggregated, both financially and academically. And that doesn't mean there aren't outliers in the individual schools that outperform everyone. But as groups, taken as groups, I saw a definite difference in that type of affiliation, in having these standards. Again, we accredited these networks also, so they were operating, 2 of them now are accredited by SACS as districts, in fact. So anytime a Somerset opens anywhere in the United States or a Matter Academy, they're instantly an accredited school. So SACS already considers, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools considers them a network that you can replicate with high quality. Well, I'd seen this happen, and I guess in my own analysis of the data, but then just recently, only 3 months ago, there was a study released by the Cato Institute, and it was Governor Bush that forwarded it to me just coincidentally the other day. And the study found, and this is a study studying the voucher programs in Chile. And Chile, even though they fund them with a voucher system, it's not unlike our charter school system in that many private schools there are operating, in fact, half of the students in Chile, more than half, attend private schools that are publicly funded, essentially. Okay, there are also some private traditional schools, but only about 11% of students attend those. But it's a great format, and they've had this going on since 1981. So here's a nation that has this, and surprisingly, I was looking at the data, 30% of those private schools, let's say, the charter type schools, 30% of them are part of franchises or groups of school networks, and 70% of them, just the data you just read out, Todd, here in the States, 70% of them are not part of a network. Well, what this study found, and they did control for demographic, was it found that the larger affiliated groups the affiliated groups did better than the independent schools, and the larger affiliated groups did best of all. So there is definitely, in this study at least, they've recognized a definite value in affiliation and in being part of a network that supports the educational system and that allows for best practices to be disseminated throughout that network. So this is a critical study, and there is no precedent, to my knowledge, in the United States for that study, but this is a great analog to look at because it's something that's been occurring for many years and something I've seen in real life occurring. And I think it's important in state policy because, and Florida's gone down that path, is recognizing that there is a value in seeing these affiliated schools. Oh, and by the way, when they compared the performance of the independent, let's say the charter schools that are the mom and pops, to the traditional public schools in Chile, there was no difference collectively. Certainly there were outliers within the independents that were high performing, but as a whole, there was no difference, which is the data we're currently, we tend to see in charters. But there was a huge difference with the affiliated groups and how those groups were performing compared to the traditional public schools. So I think it's a really important study. It only came out in August of this year. And I think it requires additional analysis, and we now have the beginnings of these affiliated networks, and you mentioned some of them, Todd, in the United States. And I think it's important to begin studying how those are performing and comparing them to how the unaffiliated schools perform. But I think what you're going to find, if Chile's the example and if the data I see, is that there's certainly a value and a power to being part of an affiliated network.
Great. And so I think the one of the takeaways is for states to seriously consider some kind of a fast track or expedited process for schools with a strong track record of performance that allows them to open more quickly, maybe not having to go through quite the burdensome process that a brand new operator with no track record has to go through. But Jed, both from your work at High Tech High, but then also California's statewide benefit charter and some of the things that California has done on this, it would be good for you to weigh in on what states could do, again, to both encourage replication expansion, but keep the door open for mom and pops.
Yeah, I started on this gig about 3 years ago and spent my first couple months really traveling the entire state, trying to get a good sense about where charter schools were on a number of issues. A dynamic I saw then that is kind of disappearing before our very eyes is the following. Back then, there were three groups of folks. There were folks that I'm proudly a CMO, call me a CMO. That's number one. Number two, I'm proudly a single site school. I'll never want to be a CMO. And then there was this group that had like 2 or 3 schools, and they're like, I operate multiple schools, but I'm not a CMO. Don't call me a CMO. I don't know what I am, but don't call me one. What's happened since then is so many of the single site schools have opened a second or third school. So many of those that have had 2, 3, they're now at 8, 9, 10, that this division in the movement between single site and CMO, I think it's just starting to blur and disappear altogether. And I think it's a really healthy thing. And if you look at in California this year, well, we're going to approximately 100 schools, 90 schools opened. A larger and larger percentage are replications of successful models, either within a CMO or a single school where the parents, like where my kids go to school, and elementary school ends and they have no middle school option. I mean, people just basically beg that school, they badger that school, do the next school, and finally they give in. And so you look at what percentage of new schools that are opening are replications of successful models. It continues to increase every single year. So people wonder, why is it that you can scale and improve quality at the same time? It's because there's a very healthy self-selection bias, a very healthy built-in quality bias within the movement. All that said, I think there are 3 things that are really important to think about in terms of scaling successful models. I think what's happening in the country right now is really healthy because a number of states are in competition with one another to try and draw the highest quality charters. Now, I'm the California guy. I'm supposed to keep all of these incredible California organizations within California, but frankly, we know they're going to be going to some other places that are starting to put in place pieces that California doesn't have right now. The first one is you've got to have the funding. You absolutely have to have the funding. You basically need to be able to assure these folks that all the funding that otherwise comes to traditional public schools is going to be coming to this school as well, and there's some kind of startup funding to get things going. You just have to have it. In California, we're a mess. Everybody knows we're a mess, and it puts us at a great disadvantage. The second thing is you've got to have an authorizing situation that allows people to have confidence that if they come, they're not going to be in months and months of negotiations and fights to get a school going. And you know, a number of the highest quality people have been talking about Rocket Ship. Rocket Ship has had charters turned down in 2 different districts within 20 minutes drive of where we sit right now, in spite of the incredible results that they have. And yes, you know what, there's no way to stop Rocket Ship. If we do the appeal process and all that, we're going to be able to get them approved eventually. But why does Rocket Ship want to spend, you know, months and months doing it here when other states are saying, look, here's basically a mechanism for you to get really quickly? And the third piece is there's got to be something around facilities. And I know we're going to move more toward blended models, and there could be, you know, virtual schools will be growing. But for most schools, they need to have that sense that there is either a funding stream that will allow them to borrow the funds necessary to construct themselves, or there's some mechanism for them to access district schools that will be shared with them, and that in some way the negotiating entity trying to bring the charter management organization to the new state has the purview, has the authority to actually deliver on that promise.
Before I move on to the last topic I wanted to raise with the panelists before opening up to questions, Senator, did you want to jump in at all on this, how this is playing out in Arizona between sort of the mom and pops and some of the for-profit and non-profit?
Just very briefly, because what Fernando said rings true. I can tell you, 20 years of experience, everything he said rings true with that. I had emailed the head of our state charter board. Now, the good news for us is that we didn't have to use statute to allow for expedited. And so our state board, she said there's 2 things, you know, we have our state charter board has recently approved a brand new mission, and it revolves around increasing quality. The biggest threat, we have a state charter board, but then we have the state charter association. You know, this is your lobbying group, this is your oversight group. And they know their biggest threat as an association is poor performing charters. The ones you read about where the guy's got the Escalade, but the kids are still doing poor in school, and you know, those types of stories. We have learned greatly over 20 years. I think when we first started, if you could spell charter, you know, you got to start a school. And that, you talk about a backlash, it really hurt us. So here's the deal. Recognizing quality performance by reducing the reporting requirements for high quality charter schools, just like you mentioned, Fernando. So less reporting. So I see several lawmakers in here, faces I recognize. Great policy to have in place, and then reduce the application requirements to replicate high quality schools. And that's where we're seeing our top performing schools are really not independents in Arizona. There's your outliers. Our bottom performings are typically independents, but our top performing, they have done well, and now they're looking economies of scale, replicating different parts of the valley where opportunities abound. And then I need to make a plug for rural Arizona. It's tough sometimes to make it work financially, but we have some people that are doing incredible things with charters in rural. And I know Oklahoma, for example, doesn't allow charters in rural areas. It does not destroy the town. It does not cause a great divide. It does cause tension for that district. I grew up in rural Arizona. It causes tension for that district and that school board to say, oh, we've never had competition. I was the school board president for our largest district in Arizona, and those 33 charters in our boundaries, we thought and talked about all the time. And I love them, but boy, we talked about them all the time. Well, what are they going to do next year? How can we do it bigger, better, faster? Competition is a positive thing, but it only gets you halfway there. You have to have that quality.
Yeah, that gets to the last point I wanted to raise with the panel, which does have to do with the other half of the charter bargain. One half is, you know, we'll give you more autonomy to operate in exchange for a higher level of accountability, meaning if you don't perform, you close. And I think that's happened to some degree across the country. There's some authorizers in particular who have a history of closing down underperforming charters, but there was just one study I want to briefly mention that the Fordham Foundation did within the last year called Are Bad Schools Immortal? The Scarcity of Turnarounds and Shutdowns in Both the Charter and District Sectors. And they looked at about 2,000 low performers in 10 states over a period of 5 years and found that while the charter sector did close a higher percentage of lower performers than the districts, still at the end of that 5-year period, 72% of the low-performing charters were still open. So I think, you know, as we look to scale the high performers, keep the door open for new mom and pops to come in to do some new and interesting things. Jed, I want to start with you and really talk about what can states do to put in place the kinds of policy safeguards needed to close those schools that need to be closed, so we can really live up to the charter bargain and the promise of chartering. And I want you to particularly address the point you raised about really the faction within the charter school community who fought tooth and nail against that particular provision, because this is unfortunately is not uncommon. We've worked on this issue in Ohio and Missouri and some other places, and our toughest opponents are usually the low-performing schools in the charter sector who are fighting to stay open.
So this is something that the association's taken very seriously and have pushed forward with assertiveness, but also in constant collaboration with our membership. We were able to develop a measure that looked at how California's charter schools are doing, controlling for the demographics of students served. And we found a U shape. We found that there is a strikingly large number of schools that are way overperforming. And also, it's unique to charters. If you look in the traditional system, there are very few schools that are overperforming along these grounds. In the charter sector, very few schools in the middle, and then alarmingly large number that are persistently underperforming. Our measure showed that about 3 years ago, we had about 16% of California's charter schools were performing in the bottom 5% of all schools in the state of California. Now, we have reduced that from 16% to 11.8% in the last couple of years. We have not identified it as a trend. If we have a third year, maybe we will. And we have been trying as hard as we can to use every lever at our disposal to begin to move this thing. And I think one thing that's important is that states need to better understand, and the research community and reformers in general need to better understand what schools are performing well and which ones aren't. The facile statements that are made across this country about charter school performance being mixed is completely and utterly missing the story. Because when you talk about mixed, people say, oh, stop the whole thing. Wait a second. But if you talk about a U shape, if you talk about what percentage are way overperforming, you realize there is this valuable resource that should be leveraged. But also, what schools, what's the distribution of independent study, non-classroom-based schools on that U? What's the distribution of classroom-based schools? What's the distribution of schools that are serving low-income students? Because when you're able to do the disaggregations, what you can find in California is that the preponderance of schools that are underperforming are district-dependent schools that don't truly have full autonomy, very small schools, smaller than 100 students, and schools that are non-classroom based. And if you look at then the schools that are the classroom-based schools that are larger than 100 students, that have full autonomy from their school districts, you find that there are almost 2.5 times as many students in those schools as in underperforming. If you look at it in terms of numbers of students, it's already that J shape that we want. But people don't understand it because the deep research and the frank discussions within the charter community aren't happening. So whatever you can do, whatever your entry point is, I encourage you, I implore you to understand it. Once you understand it, then I implore you to use every means at your disposal to address it. And I bring forward the idea of better means for the closure of schools. I was the authorizer in San Diego Unified before I went to High Tech High, worked for Alan Burson. Many of you might know him, a very prominent person, a great thought leader in the United States. And he said, Jed, let's make a charter school policy and guidelines. Let's be the first in the country to do so. And let's get serious about our few underperforming charter schools. We closed our first charter school. And I worked on that for like 3 or 4 months. After that school closed, the district folks went to the facility and they saw that there was a poster that had been put inside the front window of the school. And it said, Cucioa Charter School, rest in peace. If you have questions, call Jed Wallace. But from a distance, the way they did the font, it looked like rest in peace, Jed Wallace. And the district staff, they knew that I had lost 10 years of my life working to close down this school, so they took a picture of it. I have it on my desk to this very day. We need ways to identify schools that are clearly underperforming, and then we need to find the policy means to actually make this happen. And you know, we have one idea, which is if you are a school that is missing these minimum performance expectations, you have a two-step hurdle to get over. You must get your renewal at the local level, but then you need a state entity where many of the local dysfunctional politics are erased, where a more dispassionate, real look at the data can happen. And we believe that if something like that were to happen, we would, you know, we would be able to address this issue over time. But that's just our idea. And frankly, as a movement, we need to stay really predatory for even better ideas along these lines.
Great. We have until 12 o'clock, not 12:15. So, Senator, you want to weigh in on this, and then we'll open it up to any questions here for the last 15
I do.
minutes.
I want to make sure everyone in the room heard what Jed said about just because the bell curve now may reflect districts, you don't throw it out. And so you say, how can we make it better? And that is where we are in Arizona right now. How do we make it better? You have a 15-year renewal in Arizona and then a 5-year review. And so I had sent to the charter board operator, I said, give me the latest statistics for 2011. Where are we on this 5-year review? And as she sent it to me, it was a little surprising. And this last Monday, we released our grades, our letter grades for the very first time. Many of you are familiar with Jeb Bush's letter grade bill. We passed that 2 years ago, and literally on Monday, it hit everybody. The papers, it has been all the news in Arizona, these letter grades. So I'm going to show you these numbers, but then I want to talk about a key thing that we are learning in Arizona. So this is for this year. Of the 41 charter holders who are up for renewal, that's every 15 years, 16 had to have a performance management plan before they'd be renewed. Here's the surprising one, though. For the 69 charters who are up for a 5-year review right now, 46 of them were not approved until they came in with a whole performance management plan of how they're going to improve. 67% of those charters up for their 5-year renewal are not where they need to be. We have their letter grade, but folks, it all boils down to one thing. It does no good to have choice if everyone who walks in says 1% white works just fine for me. Our parents, we are seeing as a state, our parents are not exercising that right of choice. I mentioned 113. I'm not even counting the districts, Chandler, Tempe, Gilbert, that are near my home. I could probably pick up another 100 within 6 or 7 more miles. But if a parent says, you know what, I like the receptionist and I like the principal at this school, I know it's got a D, but my kids can walk there. That is our biggest problem in Arizona right now. So all this we're talking about quality, it almost doesn't mean anything if the parents don't exercise the right. And so we're having deep conversations. What additional information do we need to get out there so that a parent will say, this is my child, I really need to be concerned with this.
Ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Kim Kendall. I'm running for Florida House of Representatives, but I'm also sit on the newly formed Northeast Florida Virtual Charter School Board in our state. And we submitted an application to Duval County School District for Florida Virtual School, and 3-inch binder, as complete as can be. Us and the 7 other charter applications all got the denial stamp. First, our state, Fernando, you need to help us on this. It's a constitutional change. Only our school districts get to decide on the charter schools. Number one, that stinks. Number two, when I spoke to the chair and the superintendent about it, it's based on points. They first said, well, you didn't come to our workshop, which was in March and April. The law didn't pass till July 1st. So we weren't even established till July 15th. And the second thing they said was on fiddlesticks. My brain just went blank. Well, it just leaves
Okay, because
me.
once you get into the House, it's gone anyway.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, the Senate's totally different there.
That was the other thing. They said the points, if they had been clerical errors, we'd have 7 to 10 days to redo it and send it back.
Right.
But if it has some substance to it, we have no recourse. We can only go and appeal to Tallahassee, which is what we're doing.
Well, I was going to recommend that appeal,
We are.
because
We're appealing. We're appealing,
We
but-
get denied. We just had wholesale denied all the virtual applications. The districts actually got together, and as you mentioned, they're the only authorizer in Florida. So you have to go to your district. Fortunately, we have a binding appeals mechanism to the State Board of Education, so that's the only real hammer to keep the districts in check. And remarkably, it has resulted, we have 500 charter schools in the state and second largest number, 175,000 students in the country. So it has worked somewhat. I would much prefer a state authorizer. But yeah, definitely appeal, and the districts are colluding this time. They don't want the virtual charters, so they're colluding to try to stop it. I mean, they use some, and some of the grounds they're using I don't think are legally sustainable. But I would agree with you, we need to work on our state constitution so that we can have a statewide authorizer.
Other than the state
Yeah.
constitution, is there any help for our 8 regional or volunteer boards that are just oversight boards as far as?
Well, let's think about it. There's probably something that can be done on that, but I think that's a great question. That's a new one.
Sir?
Hi, gentlemen. Larry Sand, president of the California Teachers Empowerment Network. Just as far as I know, nationally, about 12% of charter schools are unionized. It's the latest numbers, I believe. I'd like to ask, or anybody else who knows, in California, what percent of charter schools are unionized? And has anybody, excuse me, has anybody tracked the performance of unionized versus non-unionized schools?
So in California, we're slightly higher percentage than that, but not too much higher. But there are different kinds of unionized schools. There are, when I mentioned before, the conversions of traditional district schools, and they retain very little. They attain very little autonomy. Those schools often have the previously existing union contract in place. I've said previously that I think the charter school context is the healthiest context to drive whatever reform you are passionate about in public education. I think we desperately need new collective bargaining arrangements in the state, in public education, and I totally believe where they're going to be created is within a charter school context. And what you find is we have in California now places like Green Dot, Camino Nuevo, and a few others that have these 11-page contracts. We are certainly doing work along the lines to look at how these different levels of autonomy and how union status is affecting performance. I'd be happy, after the session, to connect with you personally so that we could talk more about that. I think it's a fascinating question and one that we're definitely looking at.
I'd like that. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Jody Ernst, Colorado League of Charter Schools research director there. One thing I wanted to mention to Fernando, and then I have 2 questions, is that I have read one study done in the U.S. on EMO, CMO versus mom and pop, and they had the opposite findings, but it's about 3 years old, so it might be a different finding now.
Right. I'm familiar with that study. The thing it didn't control for demographic factors, for example, like the Cato study in Chile. So you do need to have, it was kind of an overview, and you have to drill, it didn't drill down into the student level achievement.
I didn't remember it very
Yeah,
well. I just remember the
no.
finding was opposite.
I remember the study. It was Fordham, right? Or was it?
I honestly don't remember.
Yeah, I remember it.
Yeah.
I have a copy of that one.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm horrible with names,
Yeah.
but I remember numbers. My 2 questions are, for the 3 of you, when you're looking at that bottom end, are you considering trying to parse out the schools that are really serving high-risk kids, such as prior dropouts, pregnant and parenting? Because charter schools have really sort of rushed to that mission in a lot of states, and we're finding that some research that's being done, that their performance isn't as high as traditional schools, and it's not necessarily because of the school that they're going to. So I'm wondering what the appetite is in your 3 states, and then my last question is for Senator Crandall. Would you ever do a 15-year charter law again?
So,
I'll do the second question first.
Okay.
We would, but what's funny, when we first did it, we didn't have the 5-year renewals, and so it was too long. And everyone said, whoa, we need to stop and take a look. And so every 5 years, you need to have that opportunity to get up and running. So I like the way we have it now. But your question about, Boy, what is the deal?
Bottom end alternative
Yes,
education
yes.
high schools.
Our State Department of Education, just this week and next week, it's funny because I mentioned how we came out with our letter grades. You really can't hold certain alternative schools, and we're very tight about who we're calling an alternative school to the same standards. They are serving a much harder population. One more policy for state lawmakers to think about that we just passed this year are schools, charters, and districts that go for dropout recovery, not dropout prevention, but kids who are actually out of the system. We passed the first ever that I'm aware of, no seat time, come in here 1 month learning modules to bring those kids back, and we exempted them from not AYP, but our state standards and from the letter grades, because why would a district want to go after those kids if they're going to be punished for it? So that's a great question.
So, first, I think I completely agree that for schools serving truly alternative populations, you have to have different accountability systems in place. And in California, we have the ASAM model, Alternative School Assessment Model, and specifically, all of those schools are waived from what we are talking about. And we're talking about schools that, right here in San Francisco, 5 Keys, it is a school that is in the county jail. And it is working so well that there are now jails across the state that are coming and saying, how do I start a charter within
We have one of those too.
You know,
in Denver.
we have truly alternative where they need to have different methods. Okay. Then there is the schools that kind of almost get into ASAM qualification. And they use a lot of basic student-oriented excuses. We have very high levels of transiency. We serve a high number of pregnant students. We have a high number of kids that were previously in the foster system, whatever it may be. And what I think you have to do this work right is get on top of all the data and really cross-check it. And so after we had spent all of this time developing this measure, we found the 58 lowest performing schools by it, and we then went and visited 46 of them, let us in for a qualitative analysis where we could go through every single one of these. And what we found out is that our measure is identifying, yes, it is true that there's a higher transiency rate in general for schools that are close to being identified. But we have many schools that have far higher levels of transiency who are doing extremely well by our measure. And so when you're able to sit down with schools and say, I understand all your challenges. I know that's really tough. I know that's tough. But you know what? Here's 12 schools with the exact same demographic that you have that are kicking it out of the park. Why aren't you? You know,
That's powerful.
you have to be able to be on top of the data enough to be able to talk along these lines. With a final caveat, we all know that our data systems are not sufficient. In California, I mean, Colorado's better. Colorado's maybe the best in the nation. We wish we had what you had. Longitudinal data, trackable to individual students. And we need to push as a charter school movement for us to get that better data. And we have to stay humble. There has to be some check at the final end of the process for people to be able to go in and look at alternative data and make sure there's not something that's not been picked up by these faulty systems. But all that, aside, we still have to push forward with the systems that we have to make sure we can protect our movement for the long term.
I think we have time for one more question. Then we gotta
Giselle
wrap
Huff
up.
with the Jacqueline Yoon Foundation. This is not only the charter schools that have a problem about closing, because parents get very enamored of the school their child goes to. It's also the public schools where, you have schools that have half the kids in them that they have room for. They're just disappearing, and they still have to keep open because the parents scream bloody murder every time you say you're going to close it. So I was thinking, and I'm just asking you whether you think that this is a feasible or good idea, of the creation of the equivalent of base closing commissions, where an independent group of people that are citizens, or however you want to structure it, that actually passes on the schools in the community and says, this school has got to close.
I think I've seen some districts actually do something like that a bit in Florida, and it's still susceptible to the same political pressures. So the base closure commission or whatever, the school closure commission will put a list out of recommendations. And then once that list gets released, then everybody starts rallying around the schools that are on the list saying, well, not this one has for this reason and this one. So then unless it's truly independent and has the power to close, which that's a different point, then it will certainly be impacted by the politics. On that concept of what to do in the closures, there was one idea that I've been toying with, and we've been talking about it as a potential policy initiative. And I've talked with legislators about it and with folks at the Alliance, and that was the idea of giving the schools that need to be, or they should be closed, let's say, the opportunity, the choice of closure or affiliation with a successful, high-performing network. Because then you're not closing, then closure, which is what brings the parents out rallying against it and brings the political pressure, you've just eliminated that because you're no longer you're taking closure off. You don't take it off the table. It's still an alternative. You're unwilling to work with a successful group. And that goes to what Jed was just saying, because we see the same thing. You know, I have some of our highest performing schools that we work with have the lowest demographics. I mean, they are the parts are in the poorest, lowest income areas of town that have intractable problems, and yet those students are doing remarkably well. I mean, amazingly well. So it's hard for me when I see someone that gives me excuses and says, oh, look at our poor kids, they're all poor. And I go, well, so are these, and yet they're outperforming the students that we have in wealthy, theoretically high-end communities. So why don't you do what they're doing? And then sometimes folks just can't see what they're doing. They don't understand, because a lot of what happens in an organization is intangible. It's not something, it's palpable, you can tell, it's a great organization, but all the elements that make it up are just vast and they're intangible. But if you certainly, one alternative to just saying, and then it's in a way also to scale, to grow these programs, is say, well, give you an opportunity to collaborate and meet with 5 different high-performing networks and consider aligning with them. And I know that some of that's already happening, and we've had that happen already, but it's happening at an ad hoc basis. I mean, schools have in fact, we're in California working right now because the school was going out, was just in a terrible situation and probably should have been closed. In fact, we got there and go, well, I wonder why this place isn't already closed. There was graffiti all over the walls, the bathrooms were horrible, everything was bad about it. And now it's turned around dramatically, but it's been a 2-year process and $500,000 million later in investment just to make it happen. Or more, and I stopped counting. Anyway, but there's a possibility of doing that, and I think that maybe eliminates some of the political barriers.
One brief final word to the senator here, and then we have to break for lunch.
Critical point that you brought up, Giselle. When I was on the school board, easily that was the second toughest issue we dealt with were school closings. Moms of cheerleaders were number 1. Difficult issues, true story. But the one thing that the bill I've been toying around with trying to figure out how to make it work is a trigger. Because if you do a trigger and say this goes into effect 3 years from now, and you do it based on performance, you do it based on occupancy, plant and equipment, what it would cost to bring it up to code, literally you have this matrix and it's a trigger, and you say when you reach 8 of these 10 triggers, your school automatically closes. That is the only way I've been able to figure out how to do it in a politically savvy way, right there. Read Michelle Rhee's, the book about Michelle Rhee on the Bee Eater, where they talk about closing those 10 to 12 schools. It's fascinating. One recommendation I have is, man, don't do it 1 school a year. Just get it done and be done when it happens. Tough to do.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists and our moderators.